Side 2. Miss Poulsen, the history teacher, was discussing the difficulties of trench warfare and had begun to explain the importance of air reconnaissance when her voice trailed off into silence. She'd just seen that Jeff Reynolds had his hand up. "I was wondering," he asked, "if you knew how the pilots found their way around then, if they didn't have radar and things." For a moment, Miss Poulsen was too astonished to speak. She could hardly have been more surprised if the radiator had stepped away from the wall and casually announced it wanted to stand somewhere else. Jeff never spoke in class, unless you asked him a direct question, and sometimes not then. Miss Poulsen quickly recovered and gave the class a brief lecture on the early techniques of air navigation. "They followed the natural features of the land, you see," she explained. "With a map and a compass they could follow the roads, the rivers, and the railway lines. They could use the landmarks like churches and castles, and of course, if they got lost, they could always land in a field and look at a signpost or something." She was quite touched, as she later told her colleagues, at how grateful Jeff had been for the information, and how his friend Tom had actually asked her to speak more slowly so that he had time to make proper notes. Mr. Urquhart was one of the little circle that had gathered in the staff room to hear her extraordinary story, and he decided he might mention it to Miss Taylor. He had a feeling she'd be interested. On their way home after school, the boys bought a compass and a large road atlas of Great Britain. Sitting in Tom's bedroom, they carefully began working out their route. "The last bit's going to be the trickiest," said Jeff. "Coming down and landing in your garden. That's when we're most likely to be seen. The only way is to do it fast. Faster the better. I think it had better be me." He took another biscuit from the plate Mrs. Baxter had provided, "which means you'd better go out with Mr. Urquhart and do the first leg." "You think I should go first?" Tom hadn't had a great deal of sleep the night before. His face was pale, and he had developed a nervous tic in the cheek under his right eye. "On my own? It's probably best." Jeff was still studying the map. "I mean, if there's any problem with the navigating and things, at least you can come down and check a signpost." Jeff himself wouldn't be able to check any signposts. As Miss Taylor had rightly assessed, Jeff couldn't read. He was one of those unfortunate people who, when presented with a word like lemon, sometimes see it as melon, sometimes as no-mel, and only occasionally as lemon. It can make learning to read a confusing process, and Jeff had long since abandoned any serious attempt at doing it. "Tomorrow we'll find a quiet place outside town where you can pick me up. One of those fields behind the station might be good." Jeff took another biscuit, and then realized it was the last, and that Tom hadn't yet had any. "I'm not very hungry," said Tom. "You go ahead." Jeff looked closely at his friend. "If you don't want to do this, you can always change your mind." "Not a chance." The half of Tom's face that wasn't twitching gave a good impression of a smile. "No, looking forward to it. It'll be an adventure." On Friday, they gathered together all the things Tom would need for the journey. In a backpack they put the road atlas, the compass, the mobile phone, one of the first aid kits from Tom's bathroom, some chocolate, a piece of rope so Tom could tie himself to the seat so he did not fall out, and a second map he had bought in case the first one blew away in the wind. Both boys learned the route they would take until they knew it backwards. They needed to know it backwards, of course, as they were travelling both ways, and then after school they cycled out to check the exact spot in the field behind the station where Jeff would be waiting for Tom to pick him up. By the time he got home that evening, the twitch in Tom's cheek had become so violent it was difficult to drink his hot chocolate without spilling it. Mrs. Baxter was quite concerned and asked if he was feeling ill. Tom assured her that he had never felt better, but by Saturday morning, when Mr. Urquhart arrived, on top of the twitching, he had developed a slight stammer. "Frankly, I'm worried about him," admitted Mrs. Baxter. "I've told him he ought to stay in bed, but he won't hear of it. He's been so looking forward to going out with you." "I'm okay," said Tom. "Really, I'm fine." "Perhaps he's getting the same thing as Jeff Reynolds," said Mr. Urquhart. "He rang me this morning saying he can't come today. Apparently he's got a stomach virus." Mrs. Baxter looked doubtfully at Tom. "Maybe you should stay at home. You haven't had any breakfast and you look awful." "I'm fine," insisted Tom. "You can't keep me at home today. You just can't." Mr. Urquhart rather admired his determination. "Don't worry, Mrs. Baxter," he smiled reassuringly. "I'll bring him straight home if there's any problem." He turned to Tom. "Come on then, let's go." Mrs. Baxter, of course, didn't come out to the car. she stayed indoors and waved goodbye from the window. The site at the quarry looked very different from the day that Tom and Jeff had fallen into it. Most of the undergrowth had been cleared. Poles and tapes crisscrossed the ground in neat squares. To one side, a row of tents had been erected, along with 2 caravans and some portaloos, and the entrance to the cave where they'd found the skeleton was now covered in polythene sheeting, wrapped round scaffolding to protect it from the weather. Dr. Warner came over to meet them as they climbed out of the car. She was wearing a denim waistcoat which showed a tattoo on each shoulder, and her hair was a different colour, but she greeted them warmly and insisted on showing them round herself. In one of the tents, the skeleton of the Roman soldier lay stretched out on a table with his armour beside him. "We've established he was a centurion of the 20th Legion," she explained, "and the coins we found, as well as the details of the armour, mean he probably died somewhere towards the end of the 3rd century. Mr. Urquhart asked if they had any idea how he had died. "We think it was an accident." Dr. Warner gave the skull an affectionate rap with her knuckles. "I don't know if you noticed the type of rock in the cave." "Carboniferous limestone," said Tom. Mr. Urquhart gave him an odd look, but Dr. Warner only nodded approvingly. "Precisely. The tunnel was the shaft of a lead mine, and as far as we can see, he just happened to be in there when the roof collapsed." "You mean he suffocated?" Dr. Warner nodded. "The odd thing is, the mine was worked out at least 100 years before, so we're a little puzzled as to why our man was down there." "Perhaps he was hiding something," suggested Mr. Urquhart. "Something he didn't want anyone else to find." "If he was, we haven't found it yet." Dr. Warner led them over to another table. "All we've dug up so far are these." She pointed to a large collection of amphorae that had, she explained, once contained wine from all corners of the empire. "And there's this, of course," she added, moving to the end of the table and picking up a collection of leather straps joined by a series of buckles and clips. "We're not sure what it is, but my theory is that it's a safety harness. You know, to stop a Roman pilot falling out of his jet when he's looping the loop." Mr. Urquhart was the first to realise she was joking and laughed politely. "It has a neat inscription." Dr. Warner ran her fingers over the letters cut into one of the leather cross straps. "Licet volare si intergo Aquilae volat." "Aquila?" Tom looked up. What does that mean?" "An eagle," said Dr. Warner. "It's an old Latin proverb. A man can fly where he will if he rides on the back of an eagle. Now," she put down the harness, "how about some lunch, and then I'll show you the cave." Mr. Urquhart looked at his watch and explained that he didn't really have time for lunch. As he'd told the boys, his main reason for coming out to the site was so that he could find some alternative locations for his next geography field trip. "I'll be back about 2, he told Tom. "You're sure you'll be all right here till then?" Fine," said Tom, his face twitching violently. "No problem at all." When Mr. Urquhart had left, Tom asked Dr. Warner if she would mind if he went for a walk. What he'd have done if she'd said yes, he had no idea, but she made no objection. "Sure, go ahead, but be careful. People fall down holes in the ground round here." Aquila was still there. Carefully, Tom pulled aside the bales of straw that had covered it, climbed inside, and then sat for a moment watching as the lights blinked into life. He opened his backpack, took out the rope, and looped it under his seat before tying the ends firmly round his waist. Then he took out the compass, the road map, the telephone, a small piece of paper and some sellotape. The paper was a drawing of the 4 blue lights, shaped like a flower. On each of the quarters Tom had written a reminder of what pressing that particular button would do. Forward, back, up and down. And now he carefully taped the picture to the dashboard alongside the real thing. He kept the compass in his lap and put the map and the telephone on the seat beside him. Carefully reaching out, he put the tip of his finger on the button that his diagram said meant forward. Gently he pushed, and Aquila floated forward, light as a thistledown, out of the barn into the sunshine. The hills and grassland of the Peak District were spread out before him, but Tom was not in the mood to admire scenery. The next thing was to go up. He moved his finger to the button at the top, pushed, and Aquila rose silently through the air. There was no real sensation of movement. If Tom had had his eyes closed, he would barely have been aware that he was moving at all. But when he looked over the side, he saw a tractor that seemed no bigger than a spot of paint travelling across the field below him. "Go high," Jeff had said. If the cars look like little dots, then that's what you'll look like to them. It seemed high enough. Tom took up the compass, found east, and pulled the handle with his right hand to swing Aquila round. It was as he reached out to push the forward button again that he realised the strangest thing had happened. He wasn't frightened anymore. It was an almost perfect flight. Tom had been travelling for only a few minutes before he realised he could see his first landmark, the 6-lane ribbon of the motorway directly ahead. When he was above it, he stopped, swung Aquila round to the left, and followed the road north until he saw the unmistakable pattern of a junction. He stopped again, turned east, and tracked what, according to his map, was the A617 to Southwell. A large town passed below him at a point where the map said he ought to be flying over Mansfield. Shortly after that, Sherwood Forest went by just where it was supposed to be, and then he saw the railway cutting across the countryside ahead as clearly as a line on a piece of paper. A goods train was heading north, and Tom turned to follow it the last dozen miles to home. His only mistake was deciding to double-check his position by going down to look at a road sign. Knowing that all road turnings have signposts, he took Aquila down to a junction to look at one, and found that everything was just as it should be. According to the sign, Staveley was 7 miles ahead, and he was about to take Aquila back up when he heard the sound of an approaching car. Anxious not to be seen, Tom hurriedly pushed the up button, but unfortunately hit the back button at the same time, with the result that Aquila shot backwards and upwards at an angle of 45 degrees, taking a set of telephone cables and 3 telegraph poles as it went. At about 150 metres, the wires and the trailing poles slid off the back of Aquila and plummeted casually back to earth like a set of darts. Tom, peering over the side, was relieved to see them land among some trees instead of in the road. 2 minutes later, he was bringing Aquila down in the field behind Staveley Station and coasting over the grass to where an ecstatic Jeff was waiting. "Fantastic! You did it!" Jeff punched him happily on the shoulder. "No problems or anything?" "Not really," said Tom. "Nothing worth mentioning." Jeff took the controls for the journey back, with Tom map reading. They flew south down the railway line to Penton Castle and turned right. They followed the road back through Sherwood Forest and Mansfield to the motorway, turned south again, and finally due west to bring themselves back to the park. When Jeff dropped Tom off by the barn, they found the whole journey had taken a little under 12 minutes. 10 minutes after that, Tom was back with Dr. Warner, and when Mr. Urquhart returned, he found the two of them in the canteen tent discussing how the Romans might have gone about extracting lead ore from limestone. "Smart boy, that," the archaeologist commented as she walked with Mr. Urquhart to his car. "Must be fun having someone like that in your class." "Yes, it's very stimulating," Mr. Urquhart hesitated. "Can I ask, you didn't have any trouble getting him to talk?" "Trouble?" Dr. Warner laughed. "I don't think he's stopped since he got back from his walk. Except to eat, of course." She looked across to the canteen tent where Tom was finishing what had to be his 4th pizza. "You forget how much they can tuck away at that age, don't you?" "What did he talk about?" "All sorts of things, really. He was asking lots of questions about Roman technology to start with. You know, whether they knew about electricity, that sort of thing. Then we got on to flying for some reason. But mostly, of course, we've been discussing rocks." She shook her head in admiration. "Not many boys his age know that much geology. Surprised me." "Yes," said Mr. Urquhart thoughtfully. "It can surprise a lot of people." Mr. Urquhart looked at Tom as he walked over to the car. There was a smile on his face, no trace of a twitch, and even his stammer seemed to have disappeared. Mr. Urquhart climbed into his car and wondered what on earth he was going to tell Miss Taylor. When Tom got home, Mrs. Baxter told him that Jeff was out in the garage and wanted to see him. "Apparently he's got something to show you." In the garage, Tom found Jeff sitting in Aquila. He'd washed off all the bits of mud that had stuck to the hull in the cave and had stuck a couple of Go Fast stickers down each side and another one at the back that said, "My other car's a Ferrari." He climbed out when Tom appeared, and for some minutes the two boys simply stood there together and stared at it. Then Jeff stroked a hand along the upward curve of Aquila's bow and ran it along to the bottom of one of the gold letters. "I wonder why it's called Aquila." "It means an eagle," said Tom. "A man can fly anywhere if he rides on the back of an eagle." "Too right," said Jeff. "Too right." The front page of the Sunday Mirror next morning came as something of a shock to both boys. Jeff was helping his father put out the papers in the shop when he saw the set of exclusive pictures of a UFO spotted 7 miles south of Staveley all over the front page. Aquila's shape, with Tom inside, was clearly recognisable. He showed the paper to his father, who read the article aloud between serving customers. Mr. Reynolds had long believed that the Earth was being visited by aliens from space. According to the newspaper, a birdwatcher called Brian Bovis had seen a strange machine fly down and hover in the air at a road junction outside Hulterworth. He'd hurriedly lined up his camera for a picture, only to see the alien craft shoot up into the air where, using what Mr. Bovis described as some sort of power beam, it had rooted out a row of telegraph poles and sent them hurtling back to Earth in an obvious attempt to kill him before he could tell anyone what he'd seen. The photos of Aquila were rather blurred, as Mr. Bovis's camera had unfortunately been focused to take close-ups of a feeding hedge warbler, but you could just make out the small head and big dark eyes of the alien creature that sat inside. Wouldn't like to meet him on a dark night. Mr. Reynolds studied the photo closely. Nasty piece of work, that. He passed the paper back to Jeff and went off to serve another customer. After breakfast, Jeff took it round to show Tom. Tom had some alarming news of his own. The police had come round to his house early that morning to ask Mrs. Baxter if she'd seen any flying saucers in her garden recently. We had some reports yesterday about something in the sky, the sergeant had explained, and then a phone call from someone who says they saw it land on your lawn. You're saying somebody saw me land? Said Jeff. Yes, but it might be all right. It was only Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. Murphy was the old lady who lived on her own in the house next door to Tom's. They got the doctor round, and he said it was probably a side effect of this new medicine she's been taking for her depression. So nobody believed her? Tom shook his head. I don't think so, but it might be safest if we kept Aquila indoors for a few days, at least in the daytime. Jeff had to agree it was the only sensible thing to do. I tell you what, Jeff took out his chewing gum and stuck it on the dash. If we can't go outside or anything, we could find out what some of these do. He gestured to the lights in front of him. How? Asked Tom. Well, we push a few and see what happens. But that could be dangerous. Tom was still thinking about his near miss on the birdwatcher, and the skin under his right eye flickered faintly. Jeff shrugged. I think it'd probably be all right. I mean, you wouldn't design something like this to kill whoever it was inside it, would you? I don't know, said Tom, but He stopped. Are we going forwards? Jeff leaned over the side to peer at the floor and found Aquila was, very slowly, floating towards the door. He looked at the dashboard and saw his chewing gum had dribbled down over the forward control. He peeled it off and flicked the button back out with his fingernail. I tell you what, we'll just try one of them. I mean, one wouldn't do any harm, would it? We'll probably find it turns on the heater or something. He pointed to a small blue light in the far corner. This one looks pretty harmless. Let's try that. And before Tom could say anything, Jeff reached out a thumb and pressed firmly at the light. Nothing happened. The boys looked round, and Jeff pressed again. There was a faint smell in the air that Tom couldn't quite place, but otherwise nothing had changed. His relief mingled with a slight sense of disappointment. OK, I'll try this one. Jeff reached out a finger to a larger disc in the centre of the dashboard that glowed a luminescent yellow. I thought you said one button. One button that works, protested Jeff. There's not much point doing it unless we find one that works, is there? Where are you going? Tom was climbing out of Aquila. I'm sorry. If you want to risk getting killed, you can do it on your own. I'm going over here, out of the way. He went to stand by the wall at the back of the garage, his arms folded. I don't know what you're worrying about, said Jeff. Nothing's going to happen. He gave Tom a brief smile, pressed down with his finger, and both he and Aquila disappeared. Standing at the sink in the kitchen, peeling potatoes, Mrs. Baxter was worrying about her neighbour, Mrs. Murphy. The old lady had not been in good health for some time. She was lonely, she had trouble with her legs, and now she was seeing spaceships land in the garden. Mrs. Baxter would have liked very much to call round, to ask if she could help with the shopping, to sit down and talk over a coffee, but she couldn't. Mrs. Baxter's agoraphobia had started as nothing more than a vague reluctance to go out of the house. Over the months, the reluctance had become stronger. Until now, the truth was that she hadn't set foot outside of her house for nearly 3 years. Anything she needed she ordered over the phone or from catalogues, and Tom collected any items that couldn't be delivered. She could at least phone, Mrs. Baxter thought, as she put the saucepan of potatoes on the cooker, and ask her neighbour how she was feeling and find out exactly what the doctor had said. She was reaching for the phone when she noticed the garden fence was on fire. Eager flames were licking hungrily up one of the wooden panels at the bottom of the garden, and as she watched, Mrs. Baxter heard a dull, booming sound as Mrs. Murphy's shed, just the other side of the fence, went up in a ball of fire. With trembling fingers, she dialed 999 and asked for the fire brigade. In the garage, it was very quiet. Tom stared at the emptiness around him with a sick feeling in his stomach. "Jeff?" he called. "What's happened?" "I don't understand." Jeff's disembodied voice came from somewhere in the middle of the room. "It's got a light on. It must be there to do something." Tom looked round. Jeff's voice sounded perfectly normal, but there was no Jeff. There was nobody in the garage but himself. "Jeff? Are you there?" "I'll try it again." For a moment, Jeff and Aquila were back. Jeff, with a finger poised over the yellow button, looked disappointedly around. What a letdown! He pressed the button again and disappeared. "I think I'll try another one." "Jeff!" Tom shouted from his place at the back of the garage. "Please, don't touch anything." Tom reached behind him and grabbed a spade that had been leaning against the back wall. He picked it up and stepped cautiously forwards. "What are you doing?" came Jeff's voice. Tom ignored him, edging round to the side of where Aquila had been. He lifted the spade and let it fall. It stopped in mid-air with a clanging sound, a metre or so above the ground. "Have you gone mad? You'll damage the paint." Jeff stood up in Aquila and stared down at Tom. At least, Tom presumed he was standing up. All he could actually see was Jeff's body down to his waist. Below that, his legs and Aquila were still invisible. "What do you think you're doing?" By way of reply, Tom simply pointed, and Jeff looked down. For a moment, he froze in astonishment. But then he reached down, dipping a hand into the emptiness. It disappeared. When he lifted the hand out, it was back again. "Hang on a minute." Jeff disappeared completely as he sat down, and a moment later both he and Aquila had reappeared. His finger was poised over the yellow light. "You can see me now?" "Yes." "Oh, wow!" Aquila became visible again, and Jeff's face was wreathed in smiles. This is cool! You know what we have here?" If Tom knew, he didn't reply. He was staring thoughtfully at the spade he still held in his hand. In the centre there was a small hole about 2 centimetres across, and, judging by the dribbles of melted metal that had formed at its base, it had been made by something extremely hot. He went to the back of the garage, to the place where the spade had been leaning against the wall, and knelt down. A few centimetres above the ground he could see an identical circular hole drilled through the brickwork, its sides as smooth as glass. It went right through the wall, and he could see fronds of ivy on the other side, blowing in the wind. Jeff was half standing in an invisible Aquila, slowly bobbing up and down to watch his body vanish and then reappear. "Just as well you stayed outside, isn't it? I mean, if you hadn't, we'd have just thought it was like the first button and didn't work at all." "I wouldn't be too sure about the first button not working." Tom held up the spade for Jeff to see, and as he did so, both boys caught the sound of fire engines getting closer. There were 11 fires in all. 4 garden fences, Mrs. Murphy's shed, a sun lounger, a tree, 3 bushes and a basket of washing, all still vigorously burning when the fire brigade arrived. The fire chief was understandably puzzled that 11 separate fires should have broken out in half a dozen gardens at exactly the same time. But he decided eventually that an exploding petrol can in the garden shed must have showered its contents over the fences to start the fires on either side. It was certainly a lot more plausible than Mrs. Murphy's claim that the fires had been started by a laser cannon from the spaceship she'd seen the previous day. That wasn't an idea that anyone took seriously, though it was curious, as a police constable pointed out, that all 11 fires were in an exact straight line. "I think it might be best if we didn't try any more buttons for a while," said Tom. For the moment, Jeff agreed. On Monday morning, the boys took Aquila to school. It was a journey which normally took them about 15 minutes on foot, but the flight, with Jeff at the controls, was a matter of seconds. In Aquila, there was no waiting to cross the road, there were no late buses and no traffic hold-ups. You simply took off into the air, pointed the nose to where you wanted to go, and went. What did take time that first morning was finding somewhere in the school grounds to leave Aquila once they'd got there. As it was invisible, you might have thought they could leave it wherever they wanted. But Jeff and Tom had already realised that it was not quite that simple. Although Aquila couldn't be seen, it was still there, and if it was left where someone might walk into it, its existence would hardly remain a secret very long. Finding a place where nobody went was harder than you might think. There were plenty of places where people didn't go very often, but nowhere the boys could be absolutely sure Aquila would be undisturbed. Tom suggested leaving it above a flower bed, on the grounds that nobody walked on them, but Jeff pointed out that there were gardeners, and even as they talked, a tennis ball landed on the rose bed beneath them, and the boy who'd thrown it naturally stepped out over the flowers to retrieve it. Jeff's suggestion was that they leave Aquila high enough in the air for anyone walking around to be able to pass underneath it, but then the problem was how to get in and out. In the end, and with the bell already ringing for the start of school, they left it 3 meters in the air by a fire escape at the back of the domestic science block. It was on the edge of the school grounds, at the end of the playing field, and far enough away from most school activity for the boys to be reasonably confident of being able to retrieve it without being seen. As they hurried over towards the main building, Jeff felt a certain satisfaction at the way they had solved the problem. "It's the perfect place," he said. "It'll be safe there." From her office window on the first floor, Miss Taylor watched as the 2 boys scurried into school. They had a cheerful, happy look that merely confirmed her suspicion that they were up to no good. She swivelled round in her chair to face Mr. Urquhart. "You have no idea what they were really doing?" "As I said, I only took Tom in the end, but he just seemed to be interested in the sight." Miss Taylor thoughtfully fingered a thumbscrew on her desk. It had been a leaving present from the staff at her last school, and playing with it helped her think. "Was he carrying anything when he went home? It occurred to me that they might have found something out there while they were on your field trip, hidden it, and then gone back the second time to bring it back." Mr. Urquhart thought for a moment. "No. Tom had a backpack, but there was nothing in it. I remember he tipped everything out in the car on the way home looking for food. I suppose he might have had something in his pockets, but if it was that small, he could have brought it back the first time, couldn't he?" "Yes." Miss Taylor spun the thumbscrew another couple of turns. "And you say he talked to this woman about geology?" "That's what she told me." Mr. Urquhart nodded decisively. "She said he had a remarkable knowledge for a boy his age. I must admit, I didn't think he'd recognise Carboniferous limestone. He's never shown any of this knowledge in class." "He's never shown any knowledge in class," said Mr. Urquhart. "I've never heard him talk." At break, Tom sat in a corner of the library with the Encyclopedia of Flight on the table in front of him, studying the entry on air safety. Jeff had gone off to get something to eat from the lunch boxes they'd left in Aquila, and was probably taking a quick flight around town, but Tom had decided it was important that one of them do some basic research into the rules of the air. He was particularly anxious to avoid the sort of near collision that happened on their way home from the park the day before. They'd been flying high, breathing a bit of cloud, as Jeff put it, peacefully nibbling some ginger nuts, when an RAF Harrier had come storming towards them at something over 700 miles an hour. Afterwards, they'd realised the pilot could have had no idea they were there. They were, after all, invisible, but at the time it had felt like being run down by a train. Jeff had grabbed the controls and sent Aquila into a screaming dive as the bomber flew straight overhead, close enough for Tom to see the stenciled numbers on the missiles slung beneath its wings. By the time they'd emerged below cloud level, the Harrier had gone, but it had been a distinctly unnerving experience. Tom knew that all aircraft, military and civil, are only allowed to fly in particular areas at regulated heights, and he was hoping the encyclopedia could tell him what those were, so they could make sure Aquila was always somewhere else. He was still reading the first paragraph on the founding of the Civil Aviation Authority when Jeff appeared beside him, his face white as a sheet. He'd been running, and he was barely able to speak. "It's gone! It's gone!" He grabbed Tom's arm and pulled him out of the library. Together they ran out of the main building, along past the bike sheds, round to the back of the domestic science block. They stopped under the fire escape ladder, and Jeff picked up a stick and gave it to Tom. "Go on, try it for yourself." Tom climbed a few steps up the ladder. He used the stick to poke the air where they'd left Aquila. There was nothing there. "Did we leave it a bit higher?" "I've been all the way to the top. It's no use, I'm telling you, it's gone." "But why? Where? How?" It was the question Jeff had been asking himself ever since he discovered Aquila was no longer where they'd left it, and he had a miserable feeling he knew the answer. "I think it was the chewing gum." "What?" "The bit of chewing gum that's stuck in the forward control. It's all right as long as you remember to flick the button back out when you stop. But this morning, with such a rush—" "You forgot?" Jeff nodded. He couldn't bring himself to speak. Together, the two boys stared out across the playing field. An invisible Aquila was out there somewhere, moving further away with every passing second. They were still wondering what to do about it as the bell rang for the end of break. Miss Taylor caught Mr. Urquhart as he passed her office on the way to his classroom. "He's been to the library again." "What?" "Tom Baxter. He came in at the start of break and took out some books." Miss Taylor looked over the top of her glasses at a list in her hand. "He got the Encyclopedia of Flight, 100 Places of Interest to Visit in the Midlands, and The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells." "Goodness," said Mr. Urquhart. "What would he want with them?" "I'm going to ring his mother at lunchtime," said Miss Taylor, heading back into her office. "See if she can explain any of this." At the start of the lunch break, Tom and Jeff returned to the base of the fire escape where they'd left Aquila and wondered how you set about finding something that was invisible. They had to find it, thought Tom. Apart from anything else, they couldn't have any lunch until they did. They knew roughly the direction Aquila must be moving. It had been left pointing out across the playing field, and they knew it was about 3 meters up in the air. Jeff's idea was that they start walking across the field with long sticks, waving them above their heads until they hit something solid. Unfortunately, it was the sort of thing that would attract a certain amount of attention, particularly as the First 11 football team had just come out on the field for a practice. Tom, who'd been thinking about the problem all through double biology, had the glimmerings of a different idea. "If it's moving like it did in the garage," he said, "it must be going very slowly. We know it's heading over there." He pointed to the far side of the field. "And if we're waiting for it by the trees, when it got there, one of us could climb up and get back in." "But we don't know when it'll get to the trees, do we?" said Jeff. "We can't just stand there and wait for it." "What we have to do," said Tom, "is calculate how fast it's going, and I thought—" But at that moment, someone kicked the ball from the far end of the field, and a large boy called Mike Smithers leapt into the air and tried to head the ball into the net. As he did so, the ball disappeared, and at the same time there was a thunk as Mike's head connected with something very solid, and he collapsed to the ground. The games master blew his whistle and came running over, and the rest of the players gathered around Mike as he lay groaning on the ground. "Isn't there a map of the school grounds on the notice board?" said Tom. "Only, if we can find out how far it's gone since this morning—" He studied the distance from the domestic science block to where they were putting Mike's body on a stretcher. "We might be able to work out how long it would be before it got to the trees." Jeff looked doubtful. "You mean, like maths?" Tom wasn't entirely confident about the idea either, but it had to be worth a try. They stood at the map in the main hall, and Tom measured the distances, while Jeff carefully wrote them down. According to the measurements, it was 34 centimetres from the fire escape to the front of the goal post where Mike Smithers had bumped his head on Aquila, and a further 28 centimetres from there to the other side of the field. They'd left Aquila at 8:45 that morning, and they knew it had been outside the goal post at 1:45. All they had to do now was work out how fast it was going and how long it'd be before it got to the other side. A simple problem of arithmetic. "What we need," said Jeff 30 minutes later, "is someone who knows about maths." "I'd never have believed it," Mr. Duncan was in the staff room, addressing anyone who would listen, "if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." "Baxter and Reynolds?" Miss Taylor had only come in on the tail end of this story. "Are you quite sure?" "Positive. I found them in the form room, and there's no question they were doing maths." "What sort of maths?" "They were trying to work out a problem. I don't know where they got it from. Something about if A travels X centimetres in Y hours, how long before it gets to Z? Seriously, I couldn't believe it. Was this homework or something? Asked Miss Poulson. Mr. Duncan shook his head. I haven't set any this week. It had nothing to do with their classwork. So why were they doing it? Fun, said Mr. Duncan. That's what they told me. Fun. He shook his head in disbelief. And when I offered to explain what they were doing wrong, their little faces lit up. They were interested. They were hanging on every word like they really wanted to know. And then when I told them the answer, I forget what it was, 4 hours and something, they were so grateful. Extraordinary, isn't it? I really hadn't thought they were the type. Miss Taylor went back to her office, wondering if the world had gone quietly mad. Baxter and Reynolds doing maths. That lunchtime, she'd already had to deal with a vanishing football, a concussed football player who'd hit his head on thin air, and then, when she'd tried to ring Mrs. Baxter, an answer phone message said she'd gone out. And the one thing everyone knew about Mrs. Baxter was that she never went out. Aquila arrived at exactly the time Mr. Duncan said it would, at 5 minutes past 5. There had been a creaking sound from the tree above them, and both boys had looked up to see one of the branches being slowly pushed aside by some powerful but invisible force. Jeff had quickly swung himself up into the tree, pulled himself out along the branch, and then vanished inside Aquila. A moment later, he had flown down so that Tom could climb in beside him. The first thing Jeff did when they were airborne was use the point from a pair of dividers to poke out the bit of chewing gum that had stuck in the forward control. Tom sat beside him, hungrily eating his lunch. His egg sandwiches had been badly flattened by the football, but he ate them anyway. It had been a long time since breakfast. As they flew home, the boys were relieved to find that nothing had changed, apart from a little purple light in the centre panel of the dash that had started flashing. Tom wondered if it meant something was wrong, but, as Jeff pointed out, it doesn't have to mean anything. It'll probably turn itself off after a while. But an hour later, as Tom sat in Aquila back in the garage writing up the day's events in his exercise book, he couldn't help noticing that the light was still flashing. End of side 2.